Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. Today's session is about what you should be testing in IBM Cognos every time you do an upgrade. My name is Holly Rice. I'm the Marketing Director at Modio and also one of today's speakers. Lance Hankins, the CTO of Modio, will be presenting on today's topic as well. Before we get started, let's go over a few important webinar logistics. We are recording today's webinar and we'll share it with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit today's session and share it with your colleagues. We invite your comments and questions. Please take a look at the Q&A chat box or the purple widget in the bottom menu bar. This is where you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar, and we will take as many as we can during our Q&A session at the end of the event. There is also a survey where you can submit your feedback and request topics for future webinar sessions. You can access that survey through the green colored widget. If you are having any sort of technical difficulties with the webinar platform, try refreshing your screen, or you can access help through the yellow question mark widget. Lastly, we have a special end-of-year Cognos upgrade offer with our MoDo CI software. I'll go over that before the Q&A session, so stay tuned to hear about that. And now, let's get started on today's topic. If you've been to any of our previous webinars about Cognos upgrades, or if you've been to any of the Cognos Analytics roadshows that IBM has coordinated throughout the year, then you've learned about our 5-step upgrade methodology on doing the initial upgrade and then using this as a repeatable approach so that you can keep up with IBM's frequent releases of Cognos. And with the end of support for Cognos 10 coming up in April, it's really important to have a solid plan in place for your upgrade. So let's take a look at that 5-step methodology. Your first step is simply preparing your Cognos sandboxes, installing Modio software used for testing, and then assessing what you've got going on in your current Cognos environment. And what you're going to look for are the reports and the content that you actually use the most. From there, you'll narrow down what you're going to move to your new Cognos environment. So think of this step as if you're moving to a new home, and avoid moving any useless junk that you just don't need. And you probably have duplicate reports, so be sure and take with you only the best version. There's no sense in bringing everything with you. Then you will utilize MoDo CI's automated testing to get a baseline of what you want to move, but you're testing how it behaves in your current environment sandbox. You will test this content again in your upgrade sandbox to identify if anything negative happens when you move it. And this is the part of the upgrade we are focusing on today, the key things that you should be testing when doing an upgrade. You'll put this series of testing, analyzing, repairing, and retesting on repeat. And this is where Modio CI is a big help because you can automate the testing. In our previous webinars, we heard from our Cognos customers, and one of the big time and money wasters of upgrades is the manual aspect of testing your content. And your last step of this methodology is to go live with your upgrade. If you'd like to see an in-depth look at these 5 steps, I invite you to access the on-demand webinar, and you can do so from the gray widget with the hyperlink symbol on it in your console menu. But today, let's focus on what you should be testing. Today, Lance is going to show you how to set up test projects in Modio CI and also go into the testing criteria, which we call assertions. So before I hand off to him, let's take a look at the assertions that are important for your upgrades. output stability and output comparison. These two assertions are to make sure that your reports produce the same output from the current environment to the upgrade environment. You'll have a baseline of your outputs, and then if anything is different from that baseline, the output stability assertion will flag it. The output comparison assertion will flag differences from your baseline in the current environment to the new environment. Now, something important to be aware of is in Cognos 11, there are some defaults that are different from Cognos 10, and this can cause a lot of your data to be different. So when testing your content, what you want to do is be sure and separate the signals from the noise and only look at the actual differences that you care about. Then we have execution time stability and execution time comparison. You want to make sure that your reports don't run twice as slow in your upgraded environment. These testing assertions take a look at performance and make sure that your execution time doesn't degrade and compares the execution time from your pre to your post-upgrade environments to make sure that it is in fact acceptable. Another assertion that Lance will get into is the unsorted list and unsorted crosstab. This is in place so that if any of your arbitrarily sorted lists that can change from your pre to post upgrade environments will not get flagged. Before I hand off to Lance, I'd like to ask a few quick poll questions. First, we have the consequences of an unsuccessful upgrade for your organization are the go-live date gets postponed and additional costs are incurred, or the reputation for the BI team and Cognos gets slandered. After going live, errors in reports can cause bad decision-making. Extending the project would lead to a backlog of delivery of new informational assets, or none. There are no real consequences if we don't go live. So take a few moments here, look at your options, and pick the best one that would fit in your situation if you were unsuccessful with your upgrade efforts. And our last poll question. So we'll take a look at the results after Lance's demonstration, by the way. So this last one is, how important is it for your organization to keep up with IBM's rapid release upgrade schedule? So your first option is business intelligence is not critical for our organization, so we don't really have to keep up. The new capabilities of Cognos BA are essential for the success of BI in our organization. Or we need to upgrade to ensure the platform is supported by IBM. And your last option is we postpone upgrades as much as possible. It just disturbs our daily work. So again, take a few moments here, review the options, and pick the one that best suits your situation. Okay, so I think we've all had plenty of time to answer. So let's move on to Lance's demonstration and take a deeper look at testing with MoDio-CI for Cognos upgrades.
Today's talk is going to be focused on utilizing MoDio-CI to provide a scientific and disciplined approach to evaluating the impact of a Cognos upgrade on your BI content and configuration. The topology we're going to talk about today, which is pretty common, is starting with a customer on that has environments similar to what's shown on the left side, where the customer has a 10.x development environment, a 10.x QA environment, and a 10.x production Cognos environment. We're going to use MoDio CI. We're going to install MoDio CI. We're going to version the changes that are happening in your 10.x production environment while we're evaluating the impact of the Cognos 11 upgrade on your BI content. Typically what we recommend is that a customer is going to create a sandbox environment for their 10.x content and a sandbox environment for their 11.x content. This is typically a brand new Cognos installation that is pointed at a backup of your production content store database, right? So typically what we do is we're going to back up the production content store database. We're going to restore that backup into an account that this 10.x sandbox uses, and then restore that backup into a second database account that the 11.x sandbox uses. When we're running in this configuration, we typically recommend that customers are going to install MoDo CI on a separate server. We're going to need plenty of horsepower as far as RAM and CPU, since we're going to be doing some pretty intensive testing. As I mentioned, we're going to use a database level backup of the production content store. We're going to have two sandboxes, one for our 10.x Cognos instance, one for an 11.x Cognos instance. And one of the things we want to make sure that we do is make sure that our static content that is used in reports is also available on these sandboxes. This tends to be things like your logos and images that are shown in reports. We want those to be in the exact same relative location that they are in production. And what we're going to do first is we're going to create test projects in MoDo CI against the 10.x sandbox, and then we're going to create test projects in MoDo CI against the 11.x sandbox. One of the first things that I like to do on these upgrade validation projects is I change some of the defaults for the assertions that I'm going to be using heavily so that they exactly align with my goals on the upgrade validation project. Just very quickly, for output stability assertion, I turn off the HTML format. For output comparison assertion, I turn off the HTML and SQL formats. And very importantly, change the default instance name that I'm comparing to be the name of my C10 sandbox. For the unsorted list and unsorted crosstab assertions, I changed their type from non-executable to executable simply because I want to be able to bundle those assertions on my existing executable test cases. I don't want to have separate test cases for those. And then for my execution time stability, I changed the multiplicative buffer from 1.1 to 2.0. So visually speaking, this is what it looks like when you customize the defaults in Assertion Studio. You edit the assertion type, you come in. This is an example turning off the SQL and HTML formats by default for the output comparison assertion. And you can always turn these back on a per test case or assertion basis, but this is just what the defaults will be when we generate test cases for you. Likewise, and this one's really important, in my screenshot here I've got two sandboxes. Here's my 10.2.2 sandbox and my 11.07 sandbox. And what I've defaulted here on the output comparison assertion, I've defaulted the instance I'm comparing to be the name of my C10.2.2 sandbox. So again, it's just, right out of the box when I generate a bunch of assertions for 5,000 reports, for example, they're all set up exactly the way I want. This is an example of changing the unsorted list. Again, we're just going to change a few of these properties so we can bundle it together with our existing executable test cases. So once we've set up our defaults for the assertions that we're going to be using heavily, now we'll proceed to setting up our first test project. So the first thing we're going to do is create a test project in the C10 sandbox. We're going to really rely on the PDF format for the upgrade validation testing, because we can do both visual comparison and data comparison with the PDF output formats. We will use CSV for certain types of reports. These sort of data extract style reports, you can use the CSV format. But in the C10 test project, we're going to generate a bunch of test cases for your content, and we're going to pick a very specific set of assertions. We're going to use the output stability assertion, which compares the currently generated output to a previously memorized output. We're going to use the execution time stability, which compares previous sort of execution characteristics to current execution characteristics. Then we're going to use the unsorted list and unsorted crosstab assertions, which will warn us if we have unsorted containers in our reports. So we're going to create our C10 project that way, and we're going to create a mirror C11 project that has the exact same name, is pointing at the exact same content, but initially it's going to be an empty shell. It's going to have no test cases, no assertions, and we'll get to why we do it that way a little bit later in the presentation. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to spend some time in MoDoCI getting our 10.x version of the test project just right. Initially, when you generate the test cases and the assertions, some of the test cases may fail due to missing parameters. MoDoCI does a pretty good job of looking through your content store at things like schedules and views and saved outputs to find sample parameter values that are realistic, but there are going to be some cases where we're not able to find a set of sample parameter values for a test case, for a report that you want a test case for. So in that case, that test case will fail and will tell you it's missing parameters, and you'll click on a prompt screen to actually fill in the parameter values that you want to use as part of the test case. Another thing you're going to want to do in your C10 project is really make sure your parameters are producing outputs that are manageable, right? You don't want, a bad test case is a test case that runs for 10 years worth of data, produces a 50,000 page PDF and takes an hour to run, right? Ideally, I always say you want test cases to produce outputs that are representative but manageable. In an ideal world, if all of your test cases produced outputs that were 50 pages or less, things would run smoothly. All your executions would go pretty fast. Comparisons would go pretty fast. So CI can certainly handle large outputs, but if you want smooth throughput on these testing cycles, try to find parameters that produce small manageable outputs that are representative of your true outputs. The other thing you want to do is you want to choose parameters that produce the same report output even if new data is loaded via the ETL into the data warehouse, right? So you don't want parameters that always show you the latest data available in the warehouse. Prefer parameters that will show you data from a month ago or from 2 months ago, right? That's not going to change when new data gets loaded into the warehouse. With that said, let's jump in and show how this works in MoDoCI. So I'm going to hop over here to MoDoCI. I actually have, in this instance of MoDoCI, I've got it configured to point at 3 different Cognos environments, 10.2.2, 11.07, and an 11.08 instance that I recently set up. So today we're going to just use 10.2.2 and 11.07 to kind of show what this process looks like. So I'm going to log in to all 3 of these at once here. And then we will be in MoDoCI. On the left here, we've got our 10.2.2 instance, our 11 instance, and our 11.08 instance, right? And so one sort of fundamental unit of testing in MoDoCI is what we call a project, a test project. Test project can have numerous test cases associated with it. When I click on the little light bulb here, this is a test project. And I can see all of the test cases that roll up under this test project. I can look at the output they produce. I can look at the status. I can edit the test case by clicking on the little beaker icon, and that's a test project. So what we're going to do, getting back to our methodology, is first we're going to create a test project in the 10.2.2 instance. And what we recommend is that you identify batches of content that you can test that are related. Ideally, you want no more than 500 reports in a batch. Typically, keep them to something that is a manageable size. We're going to do batch 5 here, and we're going to use the manual approach here, so that we're going to pick a folder. Life goes a lot easier with the test projects if you can pick folders versus individual reports. You can do that, but we're going to just, rather than pick these individual reports, we're going to pick the demo reports folder, and we're going to tell MoDoCI that we want it to generate a bunch of test cases for us. We'll tell it to generate up to 100 test cases for these object types, and we're going to, as I recommended, turn off the HTML format. We're going to do primarily the PDF format for upgrade testing. We will also grab the SQL for these so we can look at it in case there is an issue with an individual report. And by default, we're going to deselect all on the assertions. There's a lot of different types of tests you can do with MoDo CI, but really today we're going to really focus on assertions that help us from a upgrade perspective. So we're going to do output stability, which I'll explain a little bit here in a minute. We're going to do execution time stability, right? And that plus a couple of assertions that will warn us if we have unsorted crosstabs or unsorted lists. So that's our default set for our upgrade project. And now MoDo CI is going to go off and generate test cases for the reports that were in that folder. Test scripts are a really powerful concept. Test scripts allow you to group together a set of test cases based on their categories or any other numerous other sort of characteristics of the test case or how it behaves. So I'm going to tell MoDo CI to go ahead and generate these default test scripts for me because I want it to put my test cases into these buckets. And with that, I have created my test project. So this is my Cognos 10 test project. I've got 7 or 8 reports in here. I have not run any of them yet, and I'm going to go ahead and kick these guys off so that I can see how they do. So in MoDo CI, test case execution is very asynchronous, right? So it's typically a kind of kick it off and forget about it and go do something else while these things are running. You can kick off hundreds of test cases at once if you want, and you can kind of see this grid will update itself. You'll start to see things fill in on these as they finish. For example, I can go look at the generated SQL for the Cognos usage report here, and I get a sort of a pretty printed view of each of the queries in that particular report. So we're going to wait a minute here until all of these report executions finish. Now we're starting to see the PDFs show up. All right, so again, I can click here to look at the generated PDF. This Cognos usage report is it's an audit report, so it's a report that pulls data from the Cognos audit database. And now you see MoDo CI starting to run some of the assertions on these test cases. So our initial executions have completed, and we've got a couple of successes, a few warnings, and one failure. Let's go take a look at why we have the failure. We'll click on the result to see what the result was. Looks like this particular report requires parameters, and we did not specify the parameters. So let's go over to the test case by clicking on its name and provide some parameters. So you simply come down here, click the prompt link here. You'll be shown the Cognos prompt page. This is a report on the MoDo CI against the MoDo CI database that actually will give you a listing of why test cases are failing. So we're going to click select all of our test projects there, click finish, and now we've got the required parameters for this particular test case. Let's go back to the this area, and I guess to illustrate the concept of test scripts, let's go down here before we move on. Test scripts, like I said, are a useful way to categorize or group together a set of test cases based on their characteristics. The all test script will always show you all test cases that are part of your project, but if you wanted to, for example, see all reports, all test cases where the Cognos report is failing execution, you can click on failing Cognos execution. If you want to see all test cases where the report fails validation, you can do that. Our test case failures report is failing because it requires required parameters that we had not specified. So now that it is succeeding, let's kick this guy off again. So we'll select the test case. From here, we'll kick it off again. It's going to go into pending mode and work its way through the pipeline. While that's working, I'll explain some of the other test scripts here. So large output will that'll show you all test cases that are producing overly large outputs. Long running, medium running, or short running will give you kind of group together the test cases based on how long it takes to run them. And then parameter problems are going to show you all test cases where we have missing parameters effectively, right? So notice the test case disappeared from the failing validation test script because when we reran it with parameters, it now is past validation. So let's go back to the project level so we can look at all of our test cases for this project. We'll now see that we've got 3 that are succeeding, 4 that are succeeding with warning. So we're starting to be in a good state here. So let's drill in and look at one of our our warnings here. Let's look at the multiple lists test case here. We're getting a warning for unsorted list, right? So if I look here, it's warning me that, hey, there's no sort defined on list 2. Why I like to use that assertion for the upgrade scenarios is in the absence of an explicit sort for a Cognos list or a crosstab, you're going to get the data back in sort of a default order that sometimes is sensitive to Cognos versions. So, you know, if you go from Cognos 10 to Cognos 11, sometimes that default order can be different. If you're moving CQM to DQM, the default order can be different. If you are switching from one database to another, the default order can often be different. So we like to flag those as warnings so that when you start to get output comparison failures, if you see that it's an unsorted list, that's often a sort of a causal indicator of why you got the same data back in a different order. All right, so all of our test cases now are either passing. We got a few warnings about unsorted lists and unsorted crosstabs. They're all producing output. So we're in pretty decent shape on the Cognos 10 version of our batch 5 project here. So if we go back to our approach slide here. Okay, so next step in our process here. So now we've got our C10 project just right. We're going to clone that guy and create an equivalent project against our Cognos 11 environment, right? So let's go back to MotioCI, and what we're going to do is go down to our Cognos 1107 instance, right? So we've been working in the 10.2.2 instance. We're going to go to the 1107 instance, and we're going to add a project here. We're going to name it, this is very important, we're going to name it identical to the C10 project. So upgrade dash batch 5, and we're going to pick the exact same pass. Again, that part's very important. So we're going to come out here and pick the exact same folder that we picked for batch 5 in our 10.2 version of this project. And this is very important. So for the 11 project, we don't want to generate any test cases. We want it to be an empty shell, right? So don't generate anything. Click next here, deselect all, and what we should get here is 0 test cases created. Now you still want to create your default set of test scripts here, right? So those are useful. And click next. And now what we have is an empty shell for the batch 5 upgrade project, right? So we can see the reports in version control, right? So we have version history here, but we have no test cases yet. So now what we're going to do is we're going to clone our Cognos 10.2.2 version of all those test scripts into our Cognos 11 version of the project. So what we're going to do is on the Cognos 10.2.2 project, we're going to go to the all test scripts. We're going to right click here and say clone to project, and we're going to pick our Cognos 1107 instance. We're going to pick the skeleton project that we just created, and we're going to say OK. And what MoDo CI is going to do then is going to copy all the test cases from the Cognos 10.2 batch 5 project to the Cognos 1107 batch 5 project. So this is going to take a sec, and then we're going to have effectively a duplicate project against the Cognos 1107 instance, right? So now if we go back to our 1107 instance, click on the batch 5 project, we've got the same test cases here, no results yet. Now we're going to take an extra step. We're going to add a new assertion. And I've got a diagram here that will help us understand this in a moment. But first thing we're going to do is for all the test cases in this project, we're going to generate this assertion. So deselect all here, very important. You want to really focus your assertions on things that help you with the upgrade process. So we're going to do the output comparison assertion. Now the output comparison assertion is going to compare output produced by the Cognos 11 test case to output stored in the Cognos 10.2 test case, equivalent test case. So I'm going to click OK here, and what that's going to do is for each of these test cases, it's going to add that output comparison assertion. Okay, so if I go in here and I look at briefing book, for example, I've got this set of assertions. All of these came from my duplicated project except for this new output comparison one. Again, this output comparison assertion compares the output produced in this test case to the output produced by the C10 version of this test case. So if I click here, it's comparing against the C10 equivalent test case. Same project, same path, same test case. One of the things that the PDF comparison does, and I haven't talked about this yet, but since we're here, it distinguishes between something that's a visual difference versus a textual difference, right? So a visual difference, for example, would be the font or the the pixels of a particular page, versus a textual difference is the actual data that's on the page, right? So if we extract the data, and if those are different, we're going to flag that as an error. So one we're going to flag as a warning, the other we're going to flag as an error. So I'm going to click OK here, and we're going to go back to our top level project here, and we're going to kick these off. While these are running, I will explain. I have a visual here that helps to kind of explain how output comparison works. Alright, so this is the visual that helps to explain how we're using the output stability and output comparison assertions. So the tree here, we've got MoDo CI, it's got a Cognos 10.2.2 instance and an 11.07 instance. We've got our upgrade project here and an individual test case in the project called Briefing Book. So the green box here is the Briefing Book 1 test case. It's associated with the Briefing Book report, and it's in the Cognos 10.2.2 instance. The peer of this test case is the orange box down here. This is in the Cognos 11.07 version of the project, right? This is this orange box is going to run the Briefing Book report in Cognos 11.07, and then it's going to apply these assertions. Now, the output stability assertion. Let's talk first about this because we kind of breezed by this a while ago without spending much time on it. The easiest way to think about the output stability assertion is that it's comparing the output I generate right now for this test case versus the output I generated yesterday, right? In reality, it doesn't have to be yesterday, but it's an output that was generated in the past. So I'm running the report, as defined in this test case, and then I'm comparing the currently generated output to the output stored in the memory of the output stability, which is a previously generated output, right? So that's if I'm running it in isolation in the 10.2.2 environment. The output comparison assertion is similar but different, right? So the output comparison assertion is going to compare the output produced by the orange box here, right? So it's going to compare the currently generated Cognos 11.07 output for Briefing Book to the output stored in the output stability assertion over here in the Cognos 10.2.2 environment, right? So this is really one of the fundamental mechanics we're using to compare output from C11 to the equivalent output that was generated the exact same way in Cognos 10.2.2. Now, what's shown here on the right side of this diagram is the actual results. So I've clicked on the Briefing Book test case down here, and I've actually looked at the run history of this guy, and the tab here is the latest execution of this guy. So you can see, it took 26 seconds to run. Status is warning. All of these assertions succeeded. We do have a warning on the output comparison assertion, and this is actually quite frequent in when you're comparing 11.07 output to 10.2.2 output. It tells us that the PDF files are visually different starting on page 2 of the PDF, but they're textually identical. And what that means is there are formatting differences, but if you extract the data and look at the actual data in the PDFs, the actual data is the same. And that's really what most of our customers want to know when they're doing these upgrade validation projects. Alright, so now let's go back to our Cognos 11 version of the project and see what our results are. So you can see here our test cases have finished. We got a couple of failures, and then we got some that are in the warning state. So it looks like they all produced output, so that's a good sign. Let's go and look at one of the failures to get a feel for how MoDo CI treats these differences. Now, Cognos usage is it's a report that's built on the Cognos audit database, so every time we run a report, the data in this one changes. So it's a good example of how MoDo CI can show you data differences, right? So I click on that result, and you'll notice the output comparison is telling me that the PDF files are both visually different, starting on page 1, and also textually different, right? So if I click on the PDF diff thing here, and our resolution's a little small here, so I'll kind of zoom out here a little bit, but you can see the visual highlighting of the differences are shown with the pink boxes here. I'm trying to get a scroll bar here. All right. So you'll notice that again, this is Cognos audit data. So every time we run this report, this is number of successful runs. The Cognos usage report. It was at 5:30 when we ran it in the 10.2.2 environment, and it's at 5:31 when we're running it in the 11.07 environment, right? Because it's audit data. So you can click the little checkbox here on the diff viewer for it to highlight the different regions that are different between Cognos 10.2.2 and Cognos 11. And notice that MoDo CI is smart enough not to compare things that it knows you don't care about, right? So even though there are differences in the timestamps, for example, down here, it doesn't flag that as a meaningful difference. There's a couple of other useful views here. You can toggle on. So this is the 10.2.2 version of the output in this page. This is the 11 version of the output in this page. You can page through them to go through pages of the report and start to look at the differences like that. So I'm going to go back for a sec, just look at the first page. You can toggle on or off the individual panes here, right? So if I want to show toggle off the expected, I can do that. Toggle off the actual, I can do that. There's a textual view that's very useful, especially for upgrade validation. So the text view is actually going to show me, it does a data extract of the data that's shown on these PDF pages, and will give you a diff of the data, right? So this is really useful when you're trying to sort through a large number of visual differences and that really don't matter to you, and we'll look at some examples of that in a minute, and really zero in on what's the data, right? Is the data the same, right? And so this textual view will help you with that. There's another view that's also useful for looking at formatting differences. So if I click the image overlay view, this is a view where it effectively takes, it'd be like if you took a printout of the two pages, the C10.2 version and the C11 version, took the pieces of paper and put them on top of each other and held them up to a light. You'll see highlights for every pixel that's different. So if you really want to zero in on the visual differences, the image overlay view is quite useful. So I'm going to turn that off for now. So this is a bit of an artificial difference, right? We knew this report's going to change because it changes every time we run it. Let's go look at another one that is more typical of a upgrade scenario difference. All right, so let's go back and look at the revenue by quarter result here. So if we click on this guy, all right, first thing that I key on here, this is an unsorted crosstab, right? So we may have some differences here that are really just due to the default sorts being different in Cognos 10 versus Cognos 11 under certain circumstances. So let's look at our comparison here visually. And one of the things we're going to see, when there are a lot of differences, these pink boxes kind of expand to the point where everything is highlighted. So we'll just turn that off for a second. And what you see here, I think, is notice that the data is sorted differently, right? So instead of in the Cognos 10.2 version, we've got Q3 and then Q1 and then Q2 and then Q4. versus in the Cognos 11 version, we've got Q1 and then Q3 and then Q2 and then Q4. And so really, this data is actually, it is the same, but if you, it's come back in a different sort order, right, if you will. So we can click on our text difference here to kind of see some of that. So you can start to see that the data is just coming back in a different order, right? So that's a pretty easy remediation, right? The remediation typically is, go put an explicit sort on the list, go put explicit sort on the crosstab to actually, say this is the way I want it sorted, right? So we'll show how to remediate that issue here in just a moment. All right, so in order to remediate this issue, we're actually just going to go back to our Cognos 10.2.2 environment and tell it, hey, this is the way we'd like to see this data sorted. All right, so we're going to go back to that test case. We'll click View in Cognos here. This will open the report in Report Studio. And we're going to actually just provide some sorts. All right, so I will click here and want to see this sorted in descending order and quarter close date, so we'll do that in descending order. And then I think also we'll do product here. We'll do product line in ascending, product type ascending, and product ascending. So it'll be in alphabetical order. Going to save that. We're going to go back over to MoDo CI. And we're going to look at, we'll notice there's a new version of that report. Click on this, revenue by quarter. We'll see it's now revision history 6. You can see that we just changed it. And let's go ahead and kick that guy off again. So since we changed how this data is sorted, we're also going to reset the assertions on revenue by quarter, right? So remember, output stability remembers the previous output and compares it to the current output. So since we changed the sorts, we need to reset that assertion. So I'm just going to highlight revenue by quarter, hit reset assertions here, and then I'm going to run this guy. So this is going to regenerate my 10.2.2 output. In the meantime, while that's running, I will also go show you how to promote content. So this will succeed here in a minute, but rather than watch it, let's go here to revenue by quarter, and we can take version 6, which is the version we just created, and we can promote that into our Cognos 11 environment. So in MoDo CI, you can either promote individual revisions of reports between Cognos environments, or you can create a label that captures a set of content and promote that set of content between environments. So this one, since we just promoted an individual report, we're just going to do kind of an ad hoc promotion here. So we're going to promote version 6 of revenue by quarter, and we're going to promote it into our Cognos 11.07 environment. So we're going to pick 11.07 here, and we're going to promote this guy. Yes. All right, so while that's running, and it should complete pretty quickly, let's go back to our test cases, and it looks like our revenue by quarter succeeded. So let's click up here. So revenue by quarter, it should now be in the sort order that we specified. All right, so let's now go back to our batch 5 environment in the 11.07 environment. So let's just click down here on revenue by quarter to look at the revision history of that report. Notice that you've got a promotion that occurred here when we promoted this guy just now. When we promoted revision 6 from Cognos 10.2.2. And so now we're going to go back to our test case here. And again, we're going to click revenue by quarter. We're going to reset its assertions, which clears out its memory. And then we're going to rerun that guy. And again, this is going to run the Cognos 11.07 version of this report the same exact way. It's going to compare the output produced by that 11.07 execution to the output produced by the 10.2.2 version of that execution, right? So we'll see what happens here. Okay, so this is outputs available, so it's working its way through. We'll see applying assertions, and then once the assertions are completed, we'll go look at the result. All right, success. So we took it from failure to success. Let's go look at this guy, and we'll see that now the PDF diffs are both visually identical and textually identical. So that's good. So now our 1107 instance is producing the same output for that report that our 1022 instance produced. Okay, so let's take a quick survey too on some common things when moving from 10 to 11 as far as visual formatting is concerned. Briefing Book's a good example. This is one of the samples that comes with, you know, the Cognos Go Sales samples, and you'll see a fair amount of this when moving from 10 to 11, and they're effectively minor visual differences that most people don't care about. But let's go look at them and see what happens. So here we've got on the left side we'll have the 10.2.2 version of Briefing Book, and on the right hand side we've got the 11.x version, 1107 version. Notice right off the bat the visual location of these little dots in the table of contents are different, and if you really want to zero in on how different they are, you can do that with the image overlay. So if I check image overlay here and scroll to the side, again, you'll get sort of the pink highlight on every pixel that's different, right? So we can go through here, and this screen actually has no differences, but this one does. These are just alignment differences, right? So the spacing is slightly different in 11 than it is in 10, right? And most customers don't care about this, right? So that's why we flag it as a warning. So again, you can see if you just line these two things up, they line up differently. The data is the same, right? And that's what most customers care about, right? So if we go look at the textual difference, we can look at the actual data that comes back in these, and they're identical, right? That's what really most customers care about when they're doing these sort of comparisons, right? Really, so you have to separate the noise from the signal here, right? The signal is, you know, a legitimate data difference between 10.2 and 11. That's what you care about, not necessarily the minor visual differences, right? So, but yeah, you'll see that frequently, right? As you can see here, right? But again, the data is the same. All right. And again, what you see here in the results is just a warning that says PDF files are visually different starting on page 2, but they're textually identical, which is the part you care about. Okay, so one other thing I want to highlight in today's presentation is the very flexible tagging system in MoDo CI that allows you to stick categories on test cases. And you know, MoDo CI will automatically generate categories and apply them to your test cases as well. So notice the categories for this Briefing Book test case that we're just looking at in 11 was it's been cloned from 10.2.2. That's an automatically generated one. It has visual differences, right? As we were just looking, it has visual differences, medium execution time. You can also make up your own categories, and I do this a lot when I'm helping customers with upgrades, right? So if I find a test case that you know, it's got minor visual differences, but I think it's okay, I might add a category here and call it minor visual differences. All right. And we can create a test script that grabs all test cases that have that category. Another one that gets frequently used, and let me apply it to a different report. Suppose this was a legitimate failure and not a sort of a failure just because the data changes every time we run this report. I would come in here and suppose it needed to be remediated, right? So another tag that I use, category that I use a lot, is one called needs remediation, or remediation needed. Okay, so any report that I'm, you know, like the one we did earlier where it didn't have sorts on it, right? That needs to get sent back to the team that's helping to fix reports that are not the same between Cognos 10 and Cognos 11. So I would flag that guy with a remediation needed category. And what I also like to do is create a test script that groups together all the test cases that have that category, right? So that's a really flexible way to kind of manage your workflow. I'm going to call this one, I usually name these the same as the category. So test script called remediation needed. It starts off where it's just going to select all your test cases, but we're going to add some criteria here. So we're going to say the test case criteria, I want it to be, and this is really flexible. There's a lot of things that you can do here, but we're just going to base it off categories here. So has category in, and then I'm going to pick remediation needed. And this is a way for me to just group together. And now I'm done. This is going to just group together all test cases that I flagged as remediation needed, right? So it's a really flexible way to kind of manage the workflow of your Cognos upgrade process.
Okay, so let's go back and take a look at the poll results before we get to the questions and the offer we have. So on that first one, most of you said the consequences of an unsuccessful upgrade for your organization would be that your reputation gets slandered, and you definitely don't want that. And then we have, looks like a close tie here between these other three. Go live date gets postponed, and then you're unfortunately incurring additional costs. And after going live, errors and reports can cause bad decision making. So certainly that could happen, and that would be detrimental. And then extending the project would lead to a backlog of delivery of your new information assets. So yeah, all things that you definitely do not want. And then the next poll question results, looks like we're about tied here on the importance of keeping up with the schedule, the rapid release upgrade schedule. You need to upgrade to ensure that your platform is supported by IBM, and then new capabilities of Cognos BA are essential for the success of BI in your organization. All right. Okay, so about our upgrade special, we are offering 10% off of a special installation of MoDo CI for your Cognos upgrade environment. And this is a different price from our standard MoDo CI, and we're offering 10% off that special entry price for that. So this is a good way to try out MoDo CI and see how much it can help you. If you are interested in speaking with a MoDo rep about that, just go ahead and submit your interest in the Q&A chat box. Okay, let's get to your questions. Okay, we have a question that asks, would you recommend testing all of your reports?
Well, the answer really depends. We do recommend, and this was one of the questions that I believe came up in chat, that you use MotioCI up front to kind of identify reports that aren't being used. And so you definitely don't want to spend your time testing some nook and cranny of your content store that hasn't been used in a couple years. What I usually recommend is you use MotioCI plus the audit database to kind of zero in on those and mark those as out of scope. If you've got MoDo CI installed, one of the benefits is it's going to automatically version all of your content. So it kind of frees you up to, especially in your sandboxes, start to remove the content you think is no longer used, right? So just get it out of scope. I typically recommend, you create test projects, batches of 500 or so related reports, and you work your way through them, right? So it depends. If you've got, 3,000 reports that you think are still in scope, you can easily work your way through that with MoDo CI. One of the things I didn't touch on in the live demo today was you can schedule test case execution in MoDo CI. So, for example, you might set up a couple of different test projects and then schedule them to kick off on Friday night, at midnight when, really they can kind of run unattended and be ready for you to analyze Monday morning.
Okay, great.
Okay, we've got a question about Lifecycle Manager. We're considering Lifecycle Manager. What is the value of having MoDo CI?
So Lifecycle Manager is really, it's really more a single user tool that's kind of targeted. It's okay if you want to test, 5 or 10 reports, but it's really not meant for large scale. You have no safety net. You have, obviously, as I mentioned, nothing is versioning your content as you're changing it. You've got no ability to promote content between environments. You've got no scheduling. There's no reporting over the results that it generates. In MoDo CI, we store all of our test case results and outputs, information on the outputs in a database that you can write reports on and do queries on. I will say even, and some of you are probably familiar with IBM's Bring the Base Forward program that's being implemented by IBM Lab Services, and they chose MoDo CI to go out and use in the Bring the Base Forward project. So I think really MoDo CI is far better suited, especially for the large-scale kind of upgrade validation projects.
Okay, there's something about we only validate our reports.
Right. So and MoDo CI also does validation. So validation is, like if you load a report in a report studio or the authoring studio and you click the little checkbox, right? That'll do what we call Cognos validation, and that is sort of the first step in kind of the first litmus test of is this report valid. But it says nothing about the output, right? And if you go back to the example we used where we got the data back in a different order in Cognos 11 versus Cognos 10, both of those reports are going to validate, but they produce different output, right? And so validation kind of helps sort of surface some high-level problems, but it doesn't do anything with respect to validating that the output is actually what you expect.
Okay, great. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get to as many as we can. If we don't get to your question today, we will contact you with an answer for that. So we got a 2-part question asking about, okay, the process shown today assumes C10 and C11 are on the same platforms, like Unix to Unix, Windows to Windows. What if you don't have that scenario? And it also asked about the content store and the database.
Right. So I would say that's actually, we don't make any assumptions about your Cognos environment, right? So MoDo CI talks to Cognos through the SDK. You could have your C10 environment running on, Linux and DB2, and your C11 environment running on Windows and SQL Server. And, we will do the validation of that just fine. And that actually brings up a good point. This methodology is very useful anytime you're changing anything in your BI infrastructure, right? So if you're migrating from DB2 to SQL Server, or you're migrating from Linux to Windows, or vice versa, that can also cause changes, right? And so you can use the same methodology to surface any unintended changes in behavior for those migrations, not just the Cognos upgrade.
That's great. Okay, last question before we go is about the sandbox environments. Are they required for upgrade testing, or can we actually do the comparisons in the 10 and 11 environments?
Right. So do we require sandbox versus just doing the testing as your live, production environments? You can do testing as your live production environments. For this methodology, we advocate sandboxes. One of the things I didn't have time to show today, but you can do even performance testing, right? So I need to be able to assure that when I made this migration from Cognos 10 to Cognos 11, none of my reports got slower, right? And so we will baseline the initial performance versus the performance in Cognos 11. And so why we like to be able to do that sort of testing in sandbox is because there's a limited number of variables. If we're testing against your live production environment and it's the middle of the day and your Cognos instance is getting hammered by your normal user community, we're going to get bad readings effectively, right? Not to mention, you probably don't want us putting additional load on your Cognos environment in that scenario. So,
right. Okay, we are out of time. So, like I mentioned, we will get to your unanswered questions today. And thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.